Yes, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Caroline Lieffers, who's tonight's speaker. Caroline is the Assistant Professor of History here at the King's University in Edmonton. I'm not sure what the correct verb is. She was recently doctored, or if she successfully defended her PhD at Yale earlier on this year, and her PhD examines the history of disability and American empire. And her dissertation also won the F.W. Beinecker Prize for Western American History, which is a great accolade. Now, the good news for us is that Caroline is currently working on 2 books, which have come out of her PhD dissertation. One is about the Panama Canal, and another one is about the Omaha Nation in Nebraska. The bad news for Caroline is that she has to write these down things. But we're really looking forward to seeing those in print in due course. Her other research interests include food history and the history of childhood. And she's also host of the Disability History Association podcast. So please give that a listen. She's a very, very talented professor. We're so grateful to have her with us. Perhaps her most incredible gift, though, is the ability to choose amazing colleagues. So I'm sure Dr. Van Aarden would agree with that. I'm really looking forward to her talk tonight. And without further ado, her talk's entitled Germs of Change, How Diseases Reshape Societies. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all so much for attending this evening. I am really, really touched that you would choose to join me tonight for this conversation. So thank you. And also thank you in particular to Kathleen and Ashley for doing such a wonderful job of putting together this series and advertising it. I am going to start by getting my screen share going. So just do this. Okay. So slideshow. All right, can everybody see my PowerPoint slides? You can just nod if you can see them. Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so I want to start, as this slide probably suggests, by taking you back to the year 1967. It was a good year. Elvis married Priscilla, the first Big Mac was served, and the Monkees' I'm a Believer was all over the radio. And the US Surgeon General was feeling pretty good about life. He reportedly said in a speech that it was finally time to, quote, close the book on infectious diseases. I can't really blame him. There was a vaccine for polio, tuberculosis was finally curable with antibiotics, and a global smallpox eradication program was on the way. The Surgeon General wasn't alone in this belief. Many doctors and writers expressed some version of this glorious trust that infectious diseases would soon be a thing of the past, found only in the dusty world of museums and med school textbooks and, well, I guess history lectures like this one. In this moment of wild optimism and clearly obvious overconfidence, the schools of medicine at Yale and Harvard even scaled back their departments of infectious diseases. That obviously didn't last long. Somewhere between the Monkees and the Big Mac, we learned that nature's a bit cleverer than we are. In fact, historically speaking, this period of post-war exuberance was kind of an aberration. For centuries, even millennia, societies have experienced epidemic and pandemic diseases. The Justinian plague, cholera, polio, AIDS, COVID. And though each of these diseases is very different, and each society has vastly different contexts and beliefs, what's interesting, at least to me, about these events is how similar they actually all are. Almost by definition, an epidemic or a pandemic means that a society has met a force that it cannot control, something that it doesn't fully understand or can't contain, that shakes up any easy understanding of dominion over nature. As it circulates, the disease is often invisible. Its trajectory is uncertain. People have to learn a new set of rules in changing social and economic circumstances, and conspiracy theories and quack remedies are around every corner. Epidemics and pandemics in many ways are less commonplace perhaps today than they were in previous centuries, but they still have a mystery and a ferocity that can shake us from our everyday hubris and press us to reflect on the most fundamental of human universals. Questions like, how do we deal with the unknown? How much can we sacrifice and for how long? How do we reckon with our own mortality or the mortality of others? How do we care for one another? Who matters? There's a reason I became a historian of medicine. I think that epidemics and pandemics, like many health events, cut deep into a society. You could say they dissect it. When I look back on these extreme moments as a historian, I can see the bones and the sinews of a community. Epidemics and pandemics and how people react to them and what they think about them can show us society's structures and standards of living, their vulnerabilities and prejudices, their political and economic and spiritual priorities, the strengths and weaknesses of the social fabric and its moral bonds. That's the first point of my talk tonight, to show you that these crises, and I'll be focusing largely on the plague, smallpox, and tuberculosis, these crises show us who we were and in many ways who we still are. I have a second point that I want to make tonight as well. And that's that epidemics and pandemics and fears about them don't just illuminate the nature of societies. I think they can also change societies in ways that are sometimes trivial, sometimes terrible, and on occasion, even radical and liberatory. Many of these historic changes endure today. Thus, I think epidemics and pandemics are moments of social fragility and danger, but also perhaps of opportunity. They're the perfect time to ask not only who we are, but who we want to be. So I mentioned the trivial, the terrible, and on occasion, the radical and the liberatory. So let's start with, I guess it's not quite trivial, but certainly quotidian. Let's take a look at how pandemics and epidemics and fears about them can shape people's everyday lives. How they traveled, what they wore, how they cleaned their houses, how they interacted with one another, all of that. If you're anything like me, you've probably noticed some changes already with COVID. We can't go anywhere. We're seeing a lot of people wearing outfits that look a little bit different than usual. We might also be paying more attention to cleanliness in our homes and how we socialize with others. You might be interested to know that there are some historical precedents for pretty much all of those things. When we think about infectious diseases, a word that often comes to mind right away is quarantine. This practice actually dates back at least as far as the 14th century, the era of bubonic plague. The plague was a vicious disease. It probably started among rodents in Asia, and it could be spread to humans via fleas, as well as through coughing and droplets once a person became sick. It washed up on Europe's shores in 1347, brought by traders, a kind of slow motion precursor to the jet-setting globalization behind today's pandemics. The plague killed something like 40%, the estimates are all over the place, but maybe around 40% of Europe's population within just a few years. And to make matters worse, it didn't just go away. It made recurring appearances up to the middle of the 1700s. As a port city, Venice would struggle mightily if it had to shut down entirely. So within just a few years of the plague's first arrival in Europe, the city developed a clever compromise. Instead of simply isolating the sick, which was a technique that had been used for centuries, they would also proactively isolate any people or objects that seemed superficially all right, but might possibly have come into contact with the disease. In the 14th century, by the way, most Europeans understood disease as an imbalance of the body's humors. These were blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Imbalance between these fluids, these humors, could be caused by any number of things. The wrong food, the wrong weather, poisons from bad air, any of those types of things. And quarantine took a bit of an epidemiological leap. It assumed that this bad air or these poisons could actually lurk on healthy people and objects for a period of time. So when any vessels from any areas that were so much as rumored to have plague showed up in Venice, they were impounded and scrubbed and aired out. Initially, the rules said 30 days, but they were soon expanded to 40. And the crew and passengers, meanwhile, would be taken ashore and housed under guard. The whole thing was called a quarantine, after the Italian word quaranta, which means 40. The choice of 40 days probably won't surprise many of you. It was based on Christian scripture and practice, where the number 40 is especially important for, among many things, but purification is a key one. So we might think of the 40 days and 40 nights of the flood, 40 days Moses spent on Mount Sinai before receiving the 10 Commandments, the 40 days of Lent, and so on. This religious sanction led to a belief that 40 days was sufficient for purifying any new arrivals. The system was far from perfect. Venice had 14 plague outbreaks by 1528, and some cities would apparently lie about outbreaks to avoid having their ships quarantined. So rumors and spies circulated all over the Mediterranean. But quarantine worked well enough in practice that it was adopted by other jurisdictions. And I have to say it's a good thing that they did it, because the prevention was far better than any cure. There were no real cures for plague, but treatments might involve things like bloodletting and sweating, which were supposed to remove the hot, wet humors that were believed to cause the disease. It's a bit more mundane, but another thing that epidemics can change is how we style ourselves. I've been hearing a lot of stories about pandemic bangs and mullets and people wearing business clothes on top and then pajamas on the bottom. No comment on that one. I'm not going to say anything about what I'm wearing. But historians are especially interested, I think, in this dance between clothing as protection and clothing as danger when it comes to epidemic and pandemic diseases. Perhaps the best known pandemic outfit, if you will, is the costume that plague doctors would wear. They were hired by cities to treat sick people. And starting in the 1600s, they often wore black robes made of leather or oilcloth that was supposed to be impermeable to dangerous air. And the long masks with beaks were usually stuffed with fragrant herbs, things like juniper and mint, which would also supposedly counteract any poisons. Sometimes epidemic fashion brought new dangers in and of itself, too. In the 18th century, smallpox was the disease that was most likely to dictate one's fashion choices. It was endemic across Europe, and it would flare up every few years to take a new crop of victims. Historians estimate that it left something like half of all European adults with scars or other disfigurements. Blindness was also a common side effect of a bad case of smallpox. But when it came to scars on a person's face, makeup was perfect for covering them. And it could also give you an elegant white complexion that suggested you had never worked a day in your life. What made the best makeup, you might be wondering? Well, lead was a highly desirable ingredient since it could be quite opaque. And I actually found a recipe for a lead-based makeup. You're apparently supposed to steep the lead in a pot of vinegar and rest it in a bed of horse manure for at least 3 weeks. When the lead finally softens to the point where it can be pounded into a flaky white powder, you mix it with water and let it dry in the sun. If epidemics and pandemics are a mirror to society, perhaps in this case the mirror showed not only the ubiquity and the danger of smallpox, but also the high price that was put on a particular kind of beauty, not to mention ignorance about the risks of lead poisoning. Another radical change that happened that connects epidemics and pandemics and fashion is what happened when germs were discovered. Starting around the 1880s, many people in Europe and North America became increasingly aware that disease was caused not by bad air, but by tiny microorganisms that could infect the body. It was enough to fill the public with terror. These deadly little creatures seem to be lurking everywhere. This is an illustration from Puck, which was a popular American magazine. It's from 1900, and it shows how skirts and cloaks and other long clothes were feared all of a sudden. It seemed they could possibly bring in clouds of germs. In this case, we can see influenza and consumption and typhoid fever billowing off of this cloak. Some long skirts were sardonically called, quote unquote, septic skirts for the germs that they might have carried. And lest you simply enjoy the look of a long skirt, the article that accompanied this illustration was very stern. It said, quote, "Nothing unhygienic can be beautiful." So skirts, as you can probably guess, grew substantially shorter in the first decades of the 20th century, in large part because of these new fears about germs. Facial hair fashions also radically changed. This is, on the left, a photo of Friedrich Engels. It was taken in 1877. And no matter what you think about his economic and political philosophies, I think you can all agree that these whiskers are majestic. But by the turn of the century, they also would have been extremely out of fashion. Who knew what germs might be lurking within? The new and modern style was symbolized by a close-shaven face. In 1907, Harper's Weekly even said that, quote, "Revolt against the whisker has run like wildfire over the land." This natty couple on the right is made up of course, a woman whose stylish skirt is several inches clear of the ground, and a clean-shaven man, very much the new fashion of 1911. Even houses changed remarkably with germ theory and fears about epidemic disease. There were no antibiotics in the early 20th century, so the only offense was a good defense, keeping things as clean as possible. 19th century Victorian style was famous for these sort of overstuffed living rooms, as you can see in that top left corner. They were filled with knickknacks and cushions and heavy curtains. But the early 20th century mode of thought, more aware of germs, made these earlier living rooms seem downright reckless. Before Marie Kondo, there was a kind of hygienic minimalism fad. The parlor on the bottom from 1915 has wicker, some sort of wicker type furniture that could be easily wiped off. And even using a dustpan was kind of a no-no. Reformers encouraged women to use the newly invented vacuum cleaner. And this ad, by the way, on the right, if you take a closer look at the fine print, it promises that the vacuum will not only remove germs, but also, quote, "do away with house cleaning altogether." I really want to know where I can get one. Fear of tuberculosis germs could also lead people to make different decisions about where and how they chose to shop. This bakery in Timmins, Ontario, wanted its customers to know that its staff were all tested for tuberculosis, which at the time in the 1940s in Ontario affected close to 1 out of every 1,000 people. It's not that different, I think, from people wanting to make sure that their grocery stores and other areas where they shop are taking precautions today. And Christians too faced new concerns as they learned more about bacteriology. This ad from about 1900 offered new ways to serve communion wine, with individual cups that could be cleaned or simply discarded, and handsome wooden trays that would match the rest of your church. It probably won't surprise you that there was a lot of debate on this issue. Did individual communion cups, some people asked, stray too far from the events of the Last Supper? Did they break the social trust that existed in a congregation by implying that people should be suspicious of one another? Or had germs kind of already broken that trust? It was all very contentious, but there was at least one beneficiary. The Presbyterian Historical Society apparently acquired a gorgeous and quite valuable collection of silver and pewter by simply writing to various churches on their list and asking for their discarded communion sets. So there's that. When it comes to epidemics and pandemics, you've probably also noticed that information changes very quickly. Should we wear masks? Should we not? Who can transmit a disease? These moments are fraught with unknowns. And as you've probably experienced, communication is really important, especially since people can fail to respect the disease without constant reminders, accurate information, and social buy-in. In the US, the National Tuberculosis Association, which was founded in 1904, took it upon itself to keep people up to date. They hired the inventor, Thomas Edison, better known, of course, for the light bulb, to produce films that showed people how to do things like keep their houses clean, not put money in their mouths, and not spit on the ground. My students will recognize this image on the right here. This is from an Edison film called The Temple of Moloch. It was a silent film from 1914 that had a roller coaster of a plot. A doctor is trying to protect laborers from tuberculosis, which is flourishing in a poorly managed factory. In the course of his work, who does he fall in love with but the factory owner's daughter? If you'll pardon the bad joke, it's basically a soap opera about cleanliness. Some health behaviors could be sold through dramatic films, but for real changes, governments often turned to a more powerful tool, the law. Today, we're seeing various laws used to punish people who do things like lick products in stores or don't respect social distancing rules, but there's a long history of using state power to control health behavior, whether that's quarantine or mandatory vaccination or anti-spitting laws. Protecting public health became a way of showing good citizenship. With tuberculosis in the early 20th century, spitting was a key target. In Chicago, a warning card like this might be issued to spitters and even bystanders to tell them that they had to change their habits or risk a hefty fine. And you might find it interesting, if you look at the bottom here, that they call it an anti-spitting crusade. When cleanliness was next to godliness and knowledge about germs meant a totally different outlook on life, a kind of new set of habits, the language of religion, as Nancy Toms has argued, came easily to the organizers. New York even produced a little book in 1908. I don't have a copy of it, but I really want one. It was called Do Not Spit, a tuberculosis catechism for school children. Epidemics and pandemics then as now also create new hunger for information and for relief. And this meant new opportunities, I'm sorry to say, for people to be swindled. Adaline is a substance advertised in the top left corner newspaper clipping from the Chicago Ledger. I haven't been able to find out what was in it, but it was widely marketed as a cure for tuberculosis. What I do know is I don't think it was good for you. One doctor wrote in 1920 that it would make a better furniture polish than a tuberculosis remedy. So you can think about that if you ever get the urge to munch on a Lysol wipe or something like that. When influenza hit the city of Victoria in 1918, ads in the newspaper were outright claiming, and I don't know if this is a joke or not, that you could eat more candy and have less flu. And this ad for Chamberlain's cough remedy promised that they'd never known a single case of pneumonia from influenza when their product was used. Epidemics and pandemics clearly shape everyday experiences, whether it's the beauty of a face full of leaded makeup or laws against spitting in the streets or what candy you choose to buy. But they also ask us to think about more serious things. With their invisibility and uncontrollable nature, they heighten anxiety, and they have a way of finding human fears, turning people against each other, breaking social bonds or exploiting bonds that are already broken, and inflicting lasting pain. This is the next chapter of my talk tonight, thinking about the terrible ways that epidemics and pandemics can wear away at the social fabric. The Black Death, the plague, offers some particularly, I think, illustrative examples. It was a truly horrific disease. There was little dignity in a death from plague. It involved a wildly high fever, often vomiting blood, and enormous swellings in the lymph nodes. People could perish within just hours, and the mortality rate for those who were infected was well over half. Because they feared that the disease was caused by foul air or some other kind of environmental danger, many people fled cities in search of new ground. And this left the sick in many cases to face death alone, something that feels all too relevant today. Giovanni Boccaccio described Florence in 1348. He wrote how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbors was scarce found any that showed fellow feeling for another, how kinsfolk held aloof and never met, or but rarely. Wherefore the sick of both sexes, whose number could not be estimated, were left without resource, but in the charity of friends, and few such there were. This account, I should mention, is somewhat fictionalized, but historians still rely on it for its firsthand understanding of the emotional and social toll of the disease. Boccaccio's describing a kind of calculus of desperation. Leaving the city for safety meant abandoning loved ones, and it broke the social framework for dealing with death. Rites were important for Christian faith and also for closure. Death from plague was sudden. Many died without wills, without the attention of the clergy, and in the haste to clear away these potentially dangerous bodies, many did not receive a proper burial. There was a terrible sense of grief and futility and pain, and it was so distressing that it spawned some new forms of art. Vanitas, for example, were illustrations that emphasized the vanity of our lives, reminders of our brief and fleeting time on earth. On the left, a still life shows earthly pursuits like music and art and philosophy alongside a skull, which I obviously don't need to interpret for you. The image on the right is a different style, but a similar kind of message. If you look closely, the couple are actually pondering their skulls in the mirror, a reflection of their own mortality. As perhaps COVID-19 conspiracy theories today tell you, people in these sorts of circumstances can also grow desperate for explanations. They look for something to bring order to their experience and restore control. And in the case of plague, anxious communities looked for someone they could blame. Some focused on broad human failings. Maybe it was their society's laziness or gluttony or blasphemy. Suspicion often fell on prostitutes. In many places, angry crowds would round them up and expel them from cities, compounding their marginalization. Jewish people were also repeatedly targeted in waves of anti-Semitic violence, as illustrated here in Flanders in 1349. Epidemics highlight social fault lines. They identified who is most vulnerable. And in the case of the Black Death, those who were already on the margins of society seem to have faced a double danger. In many ways, if we turn to smallpox, it's a slightly different story. It was wildly lethal too, of course, killing something like 40,000 Europeans every year in the 17th and 18th centuries. To quote my colleague Frank Snowden, whose work has been very helpful in putting together this talk, that would be the equivalent of basically picking the largest city in Europe and wiping it off the map every single year. 1/10 of all deaths were smallpox. Yet, at least in Europe, it never led to the same wild kind of societal panic as plague did. It was endemic, so it was always present and would flare up into periodic epidemics, and people developed a certain kind of fatalistic attitude toward it. But smallpox did certainly instill unimaginable terror in another population. That was indigenous peoples in North America. And I think their story helps us see the thin line between opportunity and opportunism. Epidemics are not only historic and horrific events, but they highlight who has power and the kinds of choices and rationalizations and moral trade-offs that they might make with that power. From the 1610s through the 1630s, and also beyond that, of course, a series of epidemics struck the east coast of the United States, carrying away unimaginable numbers of people. A particularly bad one hit from 1616 to 1619. It was probably smallpox, although we're not entirely sure. And it was probably brought by European fishermen and traders and it killed a stunning 90%, to just use one example, of the Wampanoag people who live in the area of present-day Massachusetts. It's hard to appreciate, and I've given this a lot of thought, just how horrific this kind of destruction must have been. Whole villages and families and their stories and their songs, everything ruined or abandoned. And the year after this plague ended, in 1620, a boat called the Mayflower, full of religious refugees, sailed into a harbor not far away. They found an abandoned village by a freshwater brook and fields, remarkably, that were already cleared, almost ready for planting. As they explored further into the region and talked to the indigenous people they encountered, they learned about the vicious epidemic. The governor of this new Plymouth colony, William Bradford, wrote that in some areas, disease had struck so fast that, quote, skulls and bones were found in many places, lying still above the ground where their houses and dwellings had been. A very sad spectacle to behold. This was a scene of total ruin and loss, and it humbled Bradford, especially since about half of his own group didn't survive their first winter. But his account also lingered on a particular interpretation, an interpretation that would grow louder and stronger in the decades to come. He said, quote, "There is neither man, woman, nor child remaining to hinder our possession." Here I turn to scholars Jolene Rickard, who's Tuscarora, and Paul Chatt-Smith, who is Comanche, to put it best. They say, quote, "The initial explosion of death is one of the greatest tragedies in human history because it was unintended and unavoidable and even inevitable. But what happened in its wake was not." What happened is that many Puritans grew more confident in using this language, this mindset, when they encountered subsequent epidemics. To quote my colleague David Jones, they rationalized them. A good example is the smallpox that swept through the new and fragile colony of Massachusetts Bay in 1633-34. This area is a little north of Plymouth in what's now Boston, and it had recently been settled by a new batch of Puritans led by John Winthrop. And he famously wrote, "But for the natives in these parts, God's hand hath so pursued them, as for 300 miles space, the greatest of them are swept away by the smallpox, which still continues among them, so as God hath hereby cleared our title to this place." I think Winthrop was more confident than the settlers a decade earlier, and he was swept up in his own goals and his own convenience. There was no inherent reason to see this land as theirs to take. This could have been a call for them to try to nurse a people back to health, to see their own relative favor as perhaps an injunction to care for those who were not so fortunate. But as historian Joyce Chaplin says, epidemics were both moral and material events. Some settlers were racked with guilt, sure they were somehow responsible for bringing this devastation. Some reached out to help their fellow men. Some feared they might be next. And some relished the material opportunities that emerged. Disease is rarely just disease. As explanations and attitudes proliferate, they show who has power in society, the strength of our commitment to one another, and the weaknesses in our moral fabric. Tuberculosis, too, illuminated social fault lines. At first, many health reformers who focused on eliminating the causes of tuberculosis were taken with the idea of the socialism of the microbe. In an 1895 article that I'm showing here called "The Microbe as a Social Leveler," the New York City Health Commissioner explained that the microbe was no respecter of persons. It cannot be guarded against by any bank account, however large. Germs were, quote unquote, socialistic. And it meant that a wealthy person couldn't just sit in his fancy house eating his fancy food and forget about the poor, because eventually the microbes outside would, quote, pass the heavy curtains on the windows of the mansion to find their prey inside. This cartoon from the Atlanta Constitution communicated a really similar message. No matter what precautions wealthy, middle-class white people might take, they were supposedly in danger if others didn't live in equally sanitary conditions. Disease has a way of highlighting our fundamental interdependency. It was one way that people were, at least in theory, all connected and even all equal. But it's not hard to see in this cartoon how people with means could use disease not as an opportunity to sympathize with their fellow community members, but perhaps to demonize them. People suspected of having TB could be evicted or fired, and remember, this is an era before unemployment insurance. Health statistics made it clear that people with lower incomes, immigrants, and non-white communities were more likely to be afflicted, in large part because they were already underpaid and underfed and poorly housed. And while TB experts talked a good talk about seedy landlords and greedy factory owners who set up conditions that made people susceptible to disease, when it came time to intervene, many focused instead on individual people's habits. One public health nurse in 1909 even talked about how the millionaire and the professional man and the bank clerk might be counted on to learn what to do to protect others. But she wasn't so sure about the day laborers and the shop girls and the racial minorities who she deemed effectively, and these are her words, unteachable. Epidemics bred suspicion, and suspicion took root in people's existing prejudices. There's another epidemic story I want to tell that stresses all of these points, and I think it finds strong echoes in today's COVID-19. And that's what happened when the plague struck San Francisco. It was March of 1900. A man in the city's Chinatown was found dead. The authorities suspected plague, and overnight they quarantined the whole area. They literally encircled 12 square blocks with ropes, and police monitored everyone who was entering and exiting. But their quarantine, somewhat famously, put social prejudice over medical evidence. The police prohibited, quote, Asiatics from either entering or leaving, but white people were free to come and go. And very quickly, the city began a debate that pitted public health against the economy. That probably feels familiar. The quarantine was lifted after only 2 days, but not because of its unfairness. It was lifted because business interests didn't want to give the impression that San Francisco was unsafe. The city's Board of Health also began aggressively inspecting buildings. The Chinese community was very worried. Only a few months earlier, something similar had happened in Hawaii. The Hawaiian government had actually tried to burn down a handful of buildings in Honolulu's Chinatown in an attempt to defeat the plague there. But the fire got out of control and ended up destroying most of the neighborhood. Many Chinese people in San Francisco worried about something similar. They hid their dead, they locked their doors, some fled the area secretly. A combination of poor communication and obvious racial targeting had made a public health problem worse. The Surgeon General also subjected the Chinese community and the Chinese community alone to an experimental new plague vaccine. It was brand new and dangerous, and it had painful side effects like high fever and skin inflammation, and the community had to actually fight this racially targeted vaccine program in court. They did win, and although it's kind of hard to see, this cartoon actually shows a Chinese man turning around and vaccinating health officials in the forehead. Meanwhile, this might also feel familiar, California's governor, Henry Gage, refused to publicly acknowledge that there was any plague in the city at all. He was worried about a loss of demand for California fruit, for example, and other economic risks. And he continually interfered with health officials' work, and he even tried to pass a bill, it did not go through, but he tried, to pass a bill to gag newspapers from reporting on the plague. But word got out, and by 1902, the whole jig was up, and he lost his re-election campaign. With a better public health program under a new governor, the plague was finally eliminated from San Francisco in 1904. Epidemics feed humanity's deepest fears. Fears about death, about loss, and I think also some of our worst tendencies to greed and exploitation and discrimination. As they destabilized the norm, epidemics and pandemics, I think, also led many to fall into fatalistic or sometimes binary thinking, formulating trade-offs that had certain casualties. Fleeing the city or staying with loved ones, helping suffering brothers or taking the lands that their deaths had cleared, keeping San Francisco booming or protecting its most vulnerable from disease and prejudice. I want to use this last chapter, the last minutes of my talk tonight, to stress that perhaps it doesn't have to be that way. That while epidemics and pandemics often hosted this kind of Manichaean thinking that pits one priority against another, sometimes they could actually remake those priorities altogether. They could offer opportunities for courage and growth and even liberation. One theme that I've been watching closely with COVID-19 is bravery. We see it today as people take on the danger of working in hospitals and essential services. Looking at historical examples, we can also see acts of bravery and sacrifice that are sometimes humble and sometimes extraordinary and sometimes both. I think smallpox is a good example of perhaps both. In the 18th century, there were really only 3 ways of getting immunity to smallpox. You could get it organically, which was terrifying and risky. There was also something called inoculation, which involved taking material from an infected person, usually like a sore on their skin, and rubbing it into a healthy person's skin or sometimes into their nostrils. And that would inflict, in theory, a mild case, but that could be dangerous too. There was a 3rd way. Enter the British physician, Edward Jenner. He had heard that dairymaids, of all people, were protected from smallpox, most likely because they'd already had a milder disease called cowpox, which provides some crossover immunity. Jenner thought perhaps that this could be the key to freeing people from a disease that had terrorized them for centuries, but he needed to test his theory. We don't know a lot about exactly how it all came together, but in May of 1796, we do know that Jenner found a young dairymaid who had fresh cowpox sores on her arms, and he used them to infect a little boy, James Phipps, his gardener's son, who was only 8 years old. Thankfully, little James got no more than a mild fever and some sore underarms. He was okay. And a few months later, Jenner deliberately inoculated him with the real deal, smallpox. Thankfully, again, he was okay. No disease developed, and Jenner concluded that the technique worked. It was the first public vaccination for smallpox, with vacus coming from the Latin word for cow. Jenner and little James's dare, their risk, got at the foundations of the disease and arguably remade a society. Centuries of sort of fatalistic concern over blindness and scarring and death evaporated within just a few decades as the vaccine became widespread. I should say, we don't know what little James was thinking about all this or if he had any choice at all, and the ethics of all of this are probably totally intolerable today and they bear a lot of reflection. But right now, it's fascinating because there's a large database of people, last time I checked, about 16,000, who have volunteered to be exposed to COVID-19 to test the efficacy of a potential vaccine. These are called challenge trials. They're higher risk than normal clinical trials because they involve being deliberately exposed to enough of the disease to cause illness. And there's, of course, in this case, no known cure. But in order to save possibly tens of thousands of lives, the World Health Organization has tentatively given its approval to these sorts of initiatives. If we want to see an epidemic itself, too, as a tool for liberation, a powerful example, perhaps, is what happened in Haiti. This story deserves its own lecture, but we'll touch on it briefly here. In 1802, the formerly enslaved people of Haiti had fought for their freedom and were working on establishing their own form of self-government. Napoleon, though, wanted to preserve the economic value of this French colony and possibly use it as a springboard for maybe further advancement into the Americas. He sent multiple waves of troops to try to sort of reclaim authority over Haiti. The estimate is perhaps 65,000 French soldiers ultimately came to fight in the country. Of these, about 2/3 died from another epidemic, yellow fever. The Haitian leader, Toussaint Louverture, played the environment to his advantage. He knew when and where the fevers tended to strike, and he maneuvered the foreigners into lowland areas during the rainy season where the disease, which we now know is mosquito-borne, was known to linger. These soldiers' deaths, I don't think they're anything to celebrate in and of themselves, but this price brought something utterly extraordinary. It was the first modern country to free itself from a vicious regime of slavery and colonialism, and it did so with some help from an epidemic. If we want to understand how diseases can remake the world, this is one extraordinary case. Thankfully, though, we don't need a situation as extreme as Haiti's to think about how, with the right approach, we can see a liberating potential within the tragedy of an epidemic. Tuberculosis, which of course led to various forms of discrimination, could also be turned into a tool for improving working and living conditions. Activists, for example, pointed out that if immigrants and impoverished people were so dangerous, then the clothing that they made in their sweatshops were potentially dangerous for consumers too. The Consumers League of New York suggested something called a white label campaign. This is where factories that were safe and sanitary, they would have permission to sew a special white label into clothing. This one was the Prosanis label, so I found this from a vintage fashion website. Customers would be willing to pay a little more for a product they felt was safe, and workers could have better employment conditions. And African-American reformers too found similar kinds of points of leverage. They used the fear of tuberculosis among people who did much of the laundry and the cooking and the cleaning of the rich, and they used it to advocate for better garbage collection in their neighborhoods, health education programs in their churches, and new playgrounds so that children could have access to healthful sunshine and fresh air. I'm seeing something similar happening today. Members of the disability community, for example, are talking about how COVID might make the wide sidewalks and automatic doors and remote work options that they've long been asking for into a reality. So what, of course, should we conclude from all of this? Many things, but when I look at pandemics and epidemics as a historian, I see so much in common with today. People tried new things. They grappled with fear. They wrestled with their morality and their mortality. Some faced extraordinary persecution and suffering. Diseases, as we've seen, find our social fault lines, and we would be remiss if we didn't take notice today. Who's hurting? Where have we been too arrogant? Some also showed extraordinary bravery, and some turned tragedy and pain into lasting change. And in this, I see a call to action. What would it look like if we seized this moment of destabilization, if we resisted the urge to return to normal? Because I think for far too many, the normal is nothing worth returning to. To paraphrase the writer Tara Maguire, in our confinement right now, perhaps we can better appreciate the confinement of inhumane prisons, of poverty, of domestic abuse, of racism, of marginalization, of environmental degradation. When we are liberated from this COVID confinement, where else and what else and who else might we liberate? It's not 1967 anymore. I'm afraid it might be a long time before we have the kind of naive optimism that Surgeon General had. But I hope it's neither too naive nor too optimistic to say that we can look for ways to turn this moment into a liberatory one. Thankfully, this is something that I think as Christians, we are particularly well positioned to do. We're specialists at thinking about darkness turned to light, the grief turned to joy. We might be heartened to see a new commitment to the common good in our civil society. We might be pondering what it would mean to create an economy that sees the sacredness of our deep interdependency, that couldn't even comprehend a trade-off between saving lives and saving stock portfolios. we might have a more visceral and also more transcendent understanding of what binds us to every other human life on this earth, to those who have come before and to those who will come after. And I very much look forward to hearing from those of you who have joined me today about the many ways that COVID has probably already changed your outlook. So thank you.